Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. For centuries, women have been grappling with the question of continuing or ending a pregnancy. It's a deeply personal choice, and it's been a part of women's lived experience for a long time.
That's exactly what Mary Fissell digs into in her book Pushback.
Oh, it's a fascinating historical analysis. Really gets you thinking.
And from the get-go, it challenges this idea that debates about abortion are something new. This book really pulls back the curtain on just how deep and complicated the history of abortion really is.
Yeah, and it's not just skimming the surface. Fissel goes deep, looking at everything from ancient medical texts to medieval church records to legal cases from the early modern period.
You start to see how wildly different the perceptions and the rules around abortion have been throughout history.
It's amazing, and it makes you think. If you're intrigued by this kind of historical deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe for more. You can find a link to Pushback on Amazon in the description. It's definitely worth checking out. It really gets into how ideas about abortion and the law surrounding it have changed so much over time, and it always puts women's experiences front and center.
And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring in this deep dive today.
Exactly.
We're going to follow that historical thread, just like Fissel does in Pushback. So we're going to look at how abortion was practiced, how people felt about it, and how it was judged in different periods of history. And we'll be using all those same fascinating sources that Fissel uses.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the ancient Mediterranean world. One of the first stories in the book that really jumped out at me was about this enslaved singer in ancient Greece, 4th century BCE.
Oh, yeah.
And her enslaver goes to a doctor to talk about a possible pregnancy.
Right.
What's striking to me is just how casually it's mentioned, like it's no big deal.
Right. And it really suggests that the whole idea of trying to manage reproduction wasn't a modern invention. It's been a part of life for a very long time.
Yeah, it was just a normal part of life back then.
Yeah.
And it seems like it didn't come with all the moral judgments that we see today. They even felt comfortable enough to consult a physician openly, which implies that at least in that society, it wasn't completely taboo.
Yeah, you're right. And it gets even more interesting when you look at other writings from the Hippocratic school. They talk about these investigations into conception using aborted fetuses. They actually got these fetuses from sex workers.
Wow, yeah. Just think about that for a second.
It tells you a lot about their understanding of biology and reproduction, and that they were actually pretty open about studying these things in a way that we definitely wouldn't today.
Exactly. It also shows that abortion wasn't necessarily something hidden or something that people were ashamed of,
Yeah.
at least not in that context.
Right.
And the medical texts also mention that women often used all sorts of things to try to end pregnancies. These substances or methods, they're called abortifacients.
Yeah, it was a known part of women's lives, not some secret thing they were doing in the shadows. And while doctors might have been worried about some of the methods being used, they weren't condemning women for making these choices.
Right, exactly.
It's fascinating. And this was in ancient Greece, where neither sex work nor abortion carried the same kind of moral stigma that they would later on. And get this, women actually had a pretty good understanding of which plants could be used to induce abortion.
It's credible.
The book specifically mentions pennyroyal and pomegranate. And there's evidence that women used these plants for centuries.
It really makes you wonder how they learned about these things and how they passed that knowledge down. Yeah. The book suggests that it was probably part of these oral traditions passed down from woman to woman. And they weren't brewing up complicated potions or anything. These remedies were often pretty simple, just one ingredient. And that allowed women to manage their fertility pretty discreetly as part of their everyday routines. Like preparing food or tending their gardens.
It was just a normal part of their lives. Now, when we shift gears to the Roman world, we start to see a change in how people thought about abortion. The main concerns weren't so much about morality or religion, but more about property rights and inheritance, especially for elite men.
Right. It's a really important difference.
And Cicero's story of that widowed pregnant woman is a perfect example.
Yeah, that story really brings it home. In that case, the woman was criticized for wanting an abortion, not because it was wrong to end a pregnancy, but because she was seen as throwing away her late husband's potential heir, basically his property.
Exactly. So the wrongness wasn't about the fetus itself. It was about breaking the male family line and disrupting the flow of wealth and status.
Right.
But here's the thing. Even with those concerns about lineage, the Roman medical writers still describe techniques for both medical and surgical abortions.
Right. So even though there was pressure, especially among the wealthy, to have lots of children, women were still seeking abortions. It was still happening.
Exactly. And it seems like even the doctors recognize this. Serenus, for instance, he was all about contraception, but he also acknowledged that sometimes abortion was necessary, like in cases of very young girls whose bodies just weren't ready for
It
childbirth.
was a more pragmatic approach, it seems.
And then along comes Christianity. And with it, a whole new set of ideas about sex and, of course, abortion.
Right.
But it wasn't like everyone immediately agreed on what the Christian view on abortion should be, right?
Yeah, you're right. In the early days of Christianity, there were different opinions floating around.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the Middle Ages that the church really came out with a firm, unified stance against abortion. And they based that stance on ideas about the sanctity of life and the importance of having children within marriage.
Right.
So let's move into the Middle Ages, when Christianity is really starting to gain influence. There's this interesting story in the book about Saint Bridget of Kildare.
Oh, yeah.
She miraculously ends a pregnancy in 6th century Ireland.
Right. It's quite a contrast to how strictly the church condemned abortion later on.
I know. It makes you realize that even holy figures were connected to ending pregnancies back then. Maybe it wasn't always seen as such a terrible sin.
Yeah, it definitely suggests a different cultural understanding back then.
And the early laws about abortion, they often focused on violence against pregnant women that led to miscarriages. And the punishments for that violence, they varied depending on the social status of the woman, like whether she was free or enslaved.
Right. And it also mattered how far along the pregnancy was. And there's this idea of formation that comes up a lot.
Yeah, what exactly was that all about?
Basically, formation referred to the point when people believed that a fetus started to look human. So those early laws, they were more concerned with the harm done to the woman and, the loss to her owner or husband. They weren't really thinking about the moral status of the fetus itself. And it's pretty disturbing to see how differently the law treated free women compared to enslaved women.
It's a stark reminder of the inequalities of that time. And it's around this period that some Christian figures, like Basil of Caesarea and Caesarius of Arles, start to take a much harder line against abortion.
Yes, and they really linked it to the idea of illicit sex. This was a big shift in how people within the church were thinking about it.
Yeah, it's like they were starting to focus more on controlling sexual behavior and making sure everyone was following the rules of marriage. And that's a big difference between Christianity and other religions around the Mediterranean at that time.
That emphasis on controlling sexuality, yeah, that became a key difference.
And then there's the whole thing with monastic institutions and celibacy.
Right.
And what happened when a nun got pregnant?
Yeah, that was a tricky situation. I mean, celibacy was like the foundation of monastic life. So an unwanted pregnancy was seen as breaking that sacred vow. And that definitely added another layer to how the church viewed abortion.
Right, because it wasn't just about sex outside of marriage anymore. It was about challenging a core principle of religious life.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of quickening that becomes really important. That's when a woman first feels the fetus moving.
Right.
Once a woman felt that, the church considered abortion to be a much more serious sin. They started to see it as closer to murder.
Wow, yeah. It's interesting how they relied on the woman's own experience to determine that. She was the only one who could say for sure whether she felt movement or not.
It's true. It's kind of like it gave women a little bit more leeway to end pregnancies earlier on before they felt the quickening. It was still considered wrong, but not as bad as later term abortion.
Right. And even the legal writings from that time, like those of Bracton, they mostly talked about abortion in the context of violence and miscarriage after quickening. Not so much about intentional abortions early in pregnancy.
Exactly. So there were still nuances to how both the law and the church thought about abortion. And when you look at the church court records from that time, a lot of the cases, they revolved around the circumstances that led to the pregnancy more than the act of ending it.
Like, was the woman married? Was it consensual? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And the penalties were often things like penance, not harsh legal punishments.
Right. The book talks about this case of Hugues in France in 1298. She had an unwed pregnancy, and rumors spread that she'd had a botched abortion. It seems like there was also some anti-Jewish sentiment directed at the doctor involved.
Right. It shows how prejudices and biases could influence the way people thought about and talked about abortion.
Yeah. And then there's this other French case from 1466 involving a woman named Catherine Armand. Her future sister-in-law and the sister-in-law's husband, they actually tried to force her to have an abortion. They even got doctors and apothecaries involved.
Yeah, that one's pretty wild. It shows that there were networks of people who knew about and provided abortion services, and that it wasn't always a solitary decision made by the woman alone. Sometimes family members were involved, for better or for worse.
It's crazy. And even Bishop Burchard, in his instructions to confessors, he told them to ask women specifically if they'd had abortions. So it seems like the church knew that it was happening pretty frequently and that they needed to address it through confession.
Yeah, that was a big deal. The church was clearly worried about how common abortion was among women.
And then there's this really bizarre story about Richard Roundtree's wife and the fetus that was found hidden in a sock.
Yeah, that story, it kind of shows how anxious some men felt about women having control over their own bodies, especially when they weren't around to, keep an eye on things.
Right. It's a rare glimpse into what men might have been thinking and worrying about back then.
And then we get to the early modern period, and there's this case of Adelheid in Germany in the early 16th century. She used herbs to regulate her menstrual cycle.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It's a really powerful example of how women took charge of their own bodies and used the knowledge they had to make their own decisions. And it also shows just how difficult it was for authorities to control that kind of knowledge.
Absolutely. Women like Adelheid, they were using herbal remedies that were readily available to them. And despite efforts to restrict that knowledge, it persisted.
Right. And then there's the Reformation, both Protestant and Catholic.
Right.
And you'd think it would make things more relaxed, but it actually led to even stricter laws against abortion in a lot of parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Some places even made it punishable by death.
Yeah, that was a big shift. During the Reformation, you see these big changes in how people thought about marriage, sex, and the roles of the church and the state.
Right. And it seems like both the Protestants and the Catholics wanted to impose stricter moral rules, which often meant harsher punishments for abortion, especially if it happened outside of marriage.
Exactly. It was all about enforcing a particular set of moral standards.
But here's the thing that I find so interesting. Even with these crackdowns, books on herbs and women's health, they were still openly talking about plants that could cause abortions. People like Turner, Sowerby, and Jenner, they were putting this information out there for everyone to see.
It's like this underground knowledge that just kept circulating. No matter how much the authorities tried to suppress it, it kept popping up.
It shows that knowledge is hard to control. And it also suggests that maybe abortion wasn't as universally condemned as the laws might have made it seem.
Exactly.
And in the new Protestant territories, you really see the state taking over control of morality, including sex, from the church.
Right, and that led to these more rigid patriarchal structures.
Yeah.
And a very strong condemnation of any sex that wasn't for having children, which of course included abortion.
Right. And the book also talks about how the role of midwives changed in German-speaking areas. They weren't just helping women give birth anymore. They were expected to police women and report illegitimate births and suspected abortions to the authorities.
It's pretty chilling, actually. It's like they took these women who traditionally cared for and supported other women and turned them into extensions of the state's power.
It's a reminder that even healthcare can be used as a tool of social control. And then there's this case of Maria Superior in 16th century Germany. She tried to have an abortion, and it came out that she was pregnant as a result of incest.
Right.
But what's remarkable is that her community actually seemed to support her, even though abortion was against the law.
Yeah, that's a really complicated case. It shows that while the law might have been clear, people's personal feelings about abortion weren't always so black and white. And sometimes people were willing to look the other way, especially when there were extenuating circumstances.
It's a good reminder that real life is always more complicated than the law.
Always. And it's in this period that we see the rise of this really dangerous association between witchcraft and abortion.
Right. And the Malleus Maleficarum, that book really fanned the flames. It basically claimed that women who knew about abortion were witches who had made deals with the devil.
It's incredible how they managed to twist women's knowledge of their own bodies into something evil and demonic.
It's terrifying, and it really fueled the persecution of women during that time. I mean, think about Anna Harding. She was accused of witchcraft in 17th century Eichstätt. She was a healer, and she probably provided herbal remedies to women, some of which could have been used for abortion.
And that was enough to get her killed.
I know. Her story is just heartbreaking. It shows how easily women's knowledge and practices could be twisted and used against them during times of social and religious upheaval. And this wasn't just happening in Europe. This European understanding of abortifacient plants, it traveled to the Americas with the colonists.
Right. It's another example of how knowledge, even knowledge about abortion, can spread and adapt to new environments.
Okay, so now we're in the Americas. And the book introduces us to Claige van Angola, an enslaved midwife in 17th century Cape Town.
Oh, yeah.
And she's a great example of how African knowledge about reproductive health was present in the colonies right from the beginning.
Exactly. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, they didn't just bring their labor, they brought their cultures, their traditions, and their knowledge. And that included a deep understanding of plants that could be used for abortion.
Right, and they didn't just rely on what they brought with them. They also started identifying native plants in the Americas that had similar properties.
It's amazing. I mean, imagine being forcibly taken from your homeland, enslaved, and still finding ways to assert control over your body and your reproductive choices.
It speaks to the resilience and ingenuity of these women. But of course, plantation owners and doctors, they often accused enslaved women of having abortions out of malice or defiance. They didn't want to acknowledge the toll that forced labor and sexual abuse took on women's bodies.
Right. It's so typical. They blamed the women instead of recognizing their own cruelty.
Exactly. And the early American legal cases around abortion, they often got tangled up with other concerns, like whether a woman was promiscuous or not religious enough,
Right.
like the case of Susanna Warren and William Mitchell in 17th century Maryland.
Oh, yeah. In that case, the abortion was just one part of a much bigger story, a whole scandal.
Right.
It was about a broken promise and all sorts of social drama.
Yeah. And then there's Elizabeth Coates Paschal. She was a married woman in 18th century Philadelphia, and she ended a pregnancy with the support of her husband and a bunch of healthcare providers.
Right. Her case shows how different a woman's experience could be depending on her social status and her marital status. I mean, for women in privileged positions, abortion could be a private matter handled with the help of doctors.
Right.
It's clear that race and class played a big role in shaping women's experiences.
Absolutely. And the book suggests that all this mixing of European, African, and indigenous knowledge probably made abortifacients more widely available in America.
Right. It's like all these different traditions came together and created this whole network of knowledge about reproductive health.
Now, let's move on to 19th century England. And we see some big social changes happening, especially in London. There are more unwed pregnancies, and there's less pressure on people to get married.
Right. The Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities like London changed everything. Traditional social structures started to break down, and that meant that more women were getting pregnant outside of marriage.
And Liza Wilson's story, she was a single working woman in London who wanted to end a pregnancy, is a good example of what a lot of women were going through at that time.
Yeah, she represents a whole segment of women who are trying to navigate life and make difficult choices in a rapidly changing society.
And even though information about birth control was starting to become more available in England through people like Francis Place and Richard Carlisle, abortion was still a reality for many women.
Yeah, it wasn't like contraception just solved everything. It wasn't always easy to find, it wasn't always reliable, and some people just weren't comfortable using it.
And then there was this awful law in England called the concealment law.
Yeah.
If a woman had a secret birth and the baby died, she was automatically assumed to be guilty. It's just horrifying.
I know. It created such a dangerous situation for women who were unmarried and pregnant. They were basically trapped.
Right. And so you had these clinics, like the one run by Mrs. Linfield, that offered a safer option for women who wanted to end their pregnancies discreetly. It wasn't exactly legal, but it was better than risking a dangerous secret birth.
Absolutely. Places like Linfield's, they provided a refuge for women who were desperate.
And Mrs. Linfield's case in 1848, when she was put on trial after Eliza Wilson died following an abortion, is really telling.
Yeah, that's a pivotal case.
A bunch of local women came forward to defend Mrs. Linfield. They said she was a skilled midwife and a good person. And she was actually acquitted.
It just shows that despite the law, there was a lot of sympathy for women who sought abortions and for the people who helped them.
Right. And around this time, abortion became a crime under the law in England with Lord Ellenborough's Act of 1803. The penalties were different depending on whether the abortion happened before or after quickening.
Yeah, that law was a big step towards the criminalization of abortion.
But while the law was still focused on this idea of quickening, the medical profession was moving away from it. They had new technologies, like the stethoscope, which let them hear a fetal heartbeat much earlier.
Yeah.
So they were starting to say that quickening wasn't really a scientifically meaningful marker.
Right. And that kind of shifted the power dynamics. It gave doctors more authority when it came to deciding when life began.
It's fascinating to compare what happened in England to the situation in the United States. In the U.S., it was more of a state-by-state thing. And it was actually doctors who were pushing for laws against abortion. They saw it as a way to solidify their professional status.
Yeah, in the 19th century in the U.S., the anti-abortion movement was really led by doctors who wanted to gain more control over medicine and healthcare in general.
And in the U.S., there were all these ads for abortion pills and services, which suggests that there was a demand for them and that maybe people weren't as morally opposed to abortion as they were in England.
Yeah, there was definitely a thriving market for abortion services. Madame Restell is a good example of that.
Right. And then you have people like Horatio Robinson Storer, another doctor, who led this campaign to make abortion illegal at all stages of pregnancy.
Right. And he wanted to shift the focus away from women's health and put it squarely on the moral status of the fetus.
Yeah. And there was also this disturbing element of nativism tied up with the anti-abortion movement. People were worried about immigration and the changing demographics of the country.
Exactly. They were afraid that certain groups, particularly immigrants and people of color, were having too many children.
And then there was Anthony Comstock, who went after anything he thought was obscene.
Right. He really went after abortion providers like Madame Restell.
Okay, now let's fast forward to the 20th century.
Okay.
The book tells the story of Beatrice J., a housewife in Baltimore who became an abortion provider in the mid-20th century.
Sure.
It's a good example of how abortion had been pushed underground because it was illegal.
And a lot of people who were providing abortions at that time, they didn't have formal medical training. It was a risky situation for everyone involved.
Right, and there's this whole thing about connecting abortion to organized crime.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Especially during the McCarthy era, people started associating it with communism.
It's like they were trying to demonize abortion by linking it to all these other things that people were afraid of at that time.
Yeah, and then there's the case of Sherry Finkbein in the early 1960s. She took thalidomide while she was pregnant, and it caused birth defects. She wanted an abortion, but it was illegal in her state. It was a huge case that showed just how much tension there was between medical needs and the law.
Right. It also showed how religion could influence public opinion and policy on abortion.
It's crazy how the idea of what's wrong about abortion has changed so much over time. In ancient Rome, it was about property rights. In the Americas, it was about slavery. In early modern Europe, it was about illicit sex. And in the 20th century, it became all tangled up with social anxieties and political ideologies.
It really puts things in perspective.
It's been so eye-opening to look at the history of abortion through the lens of Mary Fissell's book, Pushback. Thanks so much for helping us understand this complex topic.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey to explore these evolving ideas and practices.
I'd love to hear what you all think. What surprised you the most about this history, or what really got you thinking? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive interesting, please give it a like and share it with others.
Let's keep the conversation going.
Right. And as you think about all this history, consider how these changing views on abortion are still relevant today. What can we learn from the past, from these cycles of repression and resistance, as we try to figure out where we stand on reproductive rights today? Thanks so much for tuning into this deep dive.